This was a video inspired by a comment on a recent video from a viewer called Vise in response to an observation of mine that Nintendo does generally try to craft its messages to surprise and delight its audience where possible. Vise noted, "I must say that surprise and delight is increasingly turning into secrecy and frustration at this point. Why would they not at the very least give a clear picture for the next 6 months from a business perspective? How is it in their interest not to share what is to come, especially when they already lowered their sales predictions and the system is apparently slowing down? Nothing we are currently aware of has a certain release date, and our best source of information at this point is a reputable leaker. The whole 'there is no bad marketing' does not make sense to me unless the plan is all about getting people so frustrated that they talk more negatively about Nintendo. I really struggle to see any strategy in this behavior. Could you make a video elaborating on this?" End quote. Now, it's an interesting topic and I think well worth breaking down. Let's start by looking at the broad theory of why a secrecy-first strategy is probably beneficial for them in most circumstances, and then look specifically at 2026 and the considerations that are unique to this year's announcement schedule. We can definitely say that Nintendo hasn't always been this withholding. In a fit of panic about the concern of lack of games on Wii U, they basically blurted out everything that was to come quite early on for that system. For the Nintendo Switch, they revealed basically the entire 2017 lineup in January, with only Mario plus Rabbids Kingdom Battle as a surprise drop in the summer, and the Pokken Tournament port later in the year. Games were given dates generally a few weeks to a couple of months out, but the broad tenets of the first year were laid down early, and that made sense because it was a strong launch year. Zelda, Mario Kart, Splatoon, ARMS, and Xenoblade would make an excellent backbone to any year. However, the June 2017 presentation was a trickier affair to balance, as 2018 to mid-2019 was to be carried, as Nintendo knew but we did not yet, by Kirby Star Allies, Mario Tennis Aces, Yoshi's Crafted World, and Fire Emblem Three Houses, which ended up being delayed anyway. Sure, there were ports, and Holiday 2018 had some big guns in the form of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, Pokemon Let's Go, and Super Mario Party, which turned out to be bigger than anybody might have predicted based on the prior performance of that series. Plus, there was always Labo. But revealing Metroid Prime 4, the new Pokemon games, and in the 2017 Game Awards, Bayonetta 3, were all clearly efforts that were to keep up their early momentum and basically bluff out the fact that Nintendo really didn't have a deep bench of original games to release until 2019, when the 3DS teams were ready to start releasing titles onto the Switch. Some of the problems with this strategy were obvious. Metroid Prime 4 and Bayonetta 3 especially became a running sore in Nintendo's media management over the years, with every event needing to consider how to address the running questions about updates on those titles. Every Retro Studios hire became a story on Metroid Prime. Every Direct without an update became a source of concern. And of course, they had to admit to the fact that Metroid Prime 4 was actually rebooted in 2019, something that they did get some credit for announcing, but also which probably they would rather not have admitted to. Now, I suspect that this happens rather often in Nintendo. There's reason to believe that Pikmin 4 also had a prior development that was abandoned, and Aonuma mentioned that the first ideas for Echoes of Wisdom were rather different than what finally emerged. Nintendo's approach is very much to protect the creative freedom of their development staff, as well as to try to protect their core developers from too much scrutiny, keeping everything within the black box of Nintendo. This means being resistant to revealing too much about the developers themselves, except for the odd, carefully cultivated Ask the Developer interview or Game Developer Conference speech, which are ultimately industry networking events more than game promotion tools, more about trying to bring people into the industry and ultimately into Nintendo than in trying to sell the titles. Now, all of this has two purposes. For one thing, it protects Nintendo staff from the kind of harassment that might follow from a minority of fans. Recall how the Nintendo Live event in Tokyo in 2024 was delayed due to death threats from a particularly angry Splatoon player. But it also protects the company by insulating them from being too reliant on any individual personality for their success. They can't avoid this with the old guards, such as Masahiro Sakurai, but they generally like the games to stand under a corporate banner rather than being overly identified with individuals who might then leave the company and either criticize Nintendo or simply talk in a way that is unhelpful to Nintendo's own aspirations. Keeping secret the details of games, therefore, gives latitude to the development teams. Even when we basically know the games that are being developed, they like to keep this approach. For example, Mercury Steam and 18 credits both strongly imply the presence of further Metroid and Pikmin games from those teams because other games have been released with other members of the company credited, but not many of the key Nintendo adjacent personnel. It also gives a great deal of flexibility to Nintendo. Take Metroid Prime Remastered. There's decent evidence that the title was nearly complete in 2021 when it was rated in Germany in July, and yet the title was ultimately shadow dropped in February 2023, suggesting that the company sat on the title for over a year. But Metroid Prime Remastered was never likely to be some storming sales success, so it was the ideal game to have on the shelf and to deploy strategically, either to fill a gap due to other games being delayed or to line up with their own marketing aspirations for it. This clearly doesn't apply to their major tentpole titles, the Mario Kart, Zeldas, and Animal Crossings. Those kind of tentpole games are the ones they will hope to shore up console releases or holiday seasons. But as we've seen, game development can be tricky and an unpredictable process, especially if, like Nintendo, you're dedicated to quality over speed. We can usually make out the contours of a plan that might have been in the shadows of what was, including some examples of Nintendo using contingencies. A good example of this that I've highlighted before is Super Smash Bros. Ultimate's release date of December 2018, the very latest point in the calendar they could have feasibly released the game, followed by the very early release in January of New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. It seems obvious to me that New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, a game we know was completed sometime before Super Smash Bros. Ultimate because the president credited was Kimishima and not Furukawa, was lined up as a replacement holiday 2018 game in case Smash needed to be delayed. A Wii U port might not have thrilled the faithful, but 2D Mario has always been a solid seller, and it would doubtless have performed adequately well if needed, especially if it were released a little earlier, perhaps October or November. And we can see from the history of Nintendo's slipped release dates that the final approach to game releases are tricky things to fully predict. Animal Crossing New Horizons was announced in September 2018 for a 2019 release and ended up releasing in the March of 2020. Splatoon 3 was announced in February 2022 for that summer, but ended up releasing in September, technically still the summer quarter, but given that it took the slot that was previously allocated to Xenoblade Chronicles 3, it is widely speculated that it was originally earmarked for the July slot that the Xenoblade game ultimately took, and that Splatoon 2 had found great success with in July 2017. What all this shows is that even close to launch, these things are frenetic, and it's far cleaner to reveal information later, but authoritatively, where they don't need to issue clarifications or updates. So all of this considers things from the production point of view, where leaving announcements to the very last minute is obviously going to be preferable. But what about the broader considerations for Nintendo? Marketing, expectations management, and keeping the audience engaged and positive about their product lineup, especially during the launch of a new console and against the backdrop of seemingly more uncertain numbers. A few considerations need to come into play here. Firstly, from an advertising point of view, my understanding is that it's generally better to focus promotion in a limited window close to the launch of a product or event than over a staggered period where memories can degrade, as long as there's a basically good understanding of the product to begin with. Nintendo has even taken this approach with very weird products that you might think would require longer build-ups. Labo and Ring Fit Adventure were only announced weeks from launch. In contrast, where games have been given longer reveal frames, this is usually, I suspect, with an alternative motive in mind. Revealing Tears of the Kingdom in 2021 allowed them to show footage in the Switch OLED launch trailer the following month. Revealing Metroid Prime 4 in 2024 meant that they didn't have to divert attention from Switch 2 when they showed the Switch 2 version of that game, but they could still use that game as a visual showcase, plus a demonstration for mouse mode. Similarly, revealing Tomodachi Life and Rhythm Heaven over a year before their release was a strong way to communicate confidence in the original Switch, despite their plan to launch Switch 2, which of course was in a direct the very week after. In other words, revealing these games early wasn't necessarily just for fans to be excited about what was coming next, but it also served other purposes for them as well. At the present time, Nintendo is still likely a year or so away from the reveal of any new hardware iteration, and in any event, a Lite model has slightly different priorities in terms of promotion. The Lite, of course, had top-down Zelda, Luigi's Mansion, Animal Crossing, and Pokémon in its 2019 launch window, and while I'd expect the same kind of thing next time, I don't think Nintendo needs to be quite as concerned with a handheld launch now as they needed to be back in 2019, when they were really starting to fly without a net by casting aside the relatively successful 3DS as their second-tier console and pushing Switch as their single console offering, something they hadn't done since the 80s. That said, I would note that Fire Emblem and Pokémon are already on the slate for Switch 2, so you can see the contours of a more handheld-focused lineup already forming, though I don't expect Fire Emblem to arrive with the Lite model either. Another consideration is where some of their reveals fit in. I've made the case for a long while that even if they had a 3D Mario ready for an imminent release, and I still think a reveal is very imminent despite rumours of a possible 2027 release now, despite all this, they wouldn't want to reveal 3D Mario before the Mario movie. The movie is a great way to signal boost Mario content to new audiences, and for those audiences, the entire back catalogue is there to be discovered as new. Better, therefore, to maximize sales of existing titles and only then upsell people on the newest, most exciting content once they're hooked on Mushroom Kingdom action. This is especially true with the 40th anniversary putting out Super Mario Galaxy 1 Plus 2 at a relatively high price. They want these games, where the margins are probably quite large indeed, to sell in volume. It's also probably far more complicated scheduling announcements now compared to in the past, because Nintendo has so many more partners to consider. With games that don't have deep IP entanglements, you can just shove the news out of the door when you want, but Mario revelations have huge implications for contracts related to toys, theme parks, films, and more, so it all has to be very carefully thrashed out and negotiated to ensure that all stakeholders feel like they're getting their time in the sun. That's why I imagine they decided to do one big Mario blowout in September to see them through the Mario 40th window, and I expect they'll do the same with Zelda's 40th as well. Apart from this, Nintendo has actually got quite a detailed slate announced by their historic standards. We know Tomodachi Life, Pokemon Champions, and Yoshi are coming in April and May, and we can reasonably expect Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, Splatoon Raiders, and Rhythm Heaven soon after. Nintendo also has diversified its methods for delivering news, so that big date announcements and even game reveals don't necessarily need to be tied to major directs. Nintendo Today is clearly something they want to push in a big way, and while I know my commentary on it is greeted with skepticism by many, initiatives like the collectible movie cards for the 40th, the ability to check in the cinema with the Nintendo Today app, and the recent spate of reveals announced first on Nintendo Today show that they do see the value in having it, or at least they would like to promote it all the more. Connecting to people's phones and becoming front and center of people's daily lives, even just as a widget that people see, has huge and almost unquantifiable upsides for them, as Nintendo will then remain in the front of mind and their characters and worlds will become ever more familiar, even to previously quite casual players, allowing them to gradually expose people to new kinds of games that they hadn't seen before, hopefully promoting particularly series like Metroid and Kirby and others that have been underrated in the past. Especially around the movie, they want to drive people towards the app, not away from it to big video platforms like YouTube, and so having lots of smaller news releases is more likely to make the maximum inroads into their audience, while the hype around the Mario film is in full swing. On the other hand, this does potentially create frustration for long-term fans who want to see big new titles announced as opposed to being held for so long that they inevitably leak out. But I suspect the online fanbase who follow these kinds of leaks is relatively small, and more to the point, are already on the Nintendo train anyway, probably come what may. For those people who are, if you like, a tier down from the online commentary community, the people who will watch directs and might have the app but don't necessarily follow the ins and outs of every Nintendo piece of news, well, Nintendo has managed to keep a steady drumbeat of content going this year, with either Nintendo Switch 2 editions, upgrades such as Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, and new titles like Mario Tennis Aces, and if anything, they've managed to close the gap between the reveal and the ability to actually get your hands on the content that's being promoted. Now, it's true that these people will be looking ultimately for their Switch 2 purchase to provide them with major AAA experiences, not just minor upgrades on past titles. But since a good number will already own or already aspire to own the Switch, I don't know that Nintendo feel the need to base their marketing strategies around that die-hard fan base, much as we might like them to. Also, we need to consider the time it takes for these announcement plans to be made and then to feed through. It's likely that the current plans were made last year when Nintendo Switch 2 was still in short supply in Japan especially, and the initial sales were rocketing forward. Obviously, sales appear to have slackened a little bit since then, especially it would seem in the US, but the Switch 2 has still got historically high numbers under its belt. Adding big new announcements at this stage would have been not just needless, but potentially counterproductive. You want these kinds of announcements to be available to change the trajectory of discussions when things are going badly. Now, perhaps in the last few months, with a share price dip and some negative articles around the Switch 2's sales trajectory, Nintendo might have found that this emerged as a concern, but they obviously felt and built their plan around the idea that keeping their powder dry for longer would be the most important thing. The idea that the movie would create a sufficient fillip in their fortunes that they didn't need too many major game reveals, and of course, they're now sticking to this plan. This gives them the greatest flexibility for later, avoids disappointments of delays, and gives them the big gun reveals that they might require at the most maximal point when the games are hopefully that much closer to being ready. I also think that they realise that 3 directs a year, the standard on Switch until COVID, has some difficulties. Very often in the past, these directs would be criticised for being relatively light, even disappointing, because they weren't rammed with announcements. In fact, while there are a few directs that are legendary for one reason or another, it was very common over the years for some directs to be received as B- events. And of course, Nintendo know their lineup and they know how hype or not it may be. Having a smaller number of far more massive presentations avoids this issue, and by confirming games only with a window of 6 to 9 months to come, they can still be relatively confident in meeting all of their dates, although even then, Metroid Prime 4 seemed to have a bumpy landing last year. But of course, these strategies will be constantly re-evaluated. My guess is that Nintendo may judge that currently they do need to juice their numbers a little bit, but of course they also have the wherewithal to do that even under their original plans. With the Mario movie done, there's no reason not to majorly tease the next big Mario title. They also seem to have a density of releases up their sleeve, including stuff like Splatoon Raiders and Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave that have been long teased. It's obviously their wish to condition audiences to receive short-term reveals, and if you think about it, the total tonnage of game reveals is the same whenever the reveals take place. It's not like they aren't working on the next Animal Crossing or Pikmin or Mario, so it's really just a matter of when it suits their promotional and development cycles to actually reveal those titles. In many respects, holding their nerve and committing to being disciplined about not revealing too much probably conditions the audience to be always optimistic about Nintendo, even during their tricky times, as long as they can eventually manage to pull something out of the bag more often than not. Of course, the flip side is that when they genuinely do have things that are worth promoting, but they're keeping them secret, it might encourage a certain degree of negativity, but probably not the kind of extreme negativity that would happen if they ever had to reveal something that showed that they just didn't have much on their slate, as for example if they had revealed in 2017 that basically 2018 was going to be a year of ports and smaller titles. Now, all of this does open them up to their plans being leaked. Of course it does. It's obviously a risk they run, but for one thing, they obviously must do everything they can to mitigate leaks, and for another, it's ultimately a smaller number of people who will be the audience for those leaks, and especially as they control information through Nintendo today, they have still managed to drop some fairly big surprises over the years themselves. So, what is the future for Nintendo's announcement schedule? Here are my general expectations. I think currently June is shaping up to be the big blowout for the year, and I think we'll see 3D Mario and a bunch of games scheduled for release through to December, if not March of 2027. I think it's very likely that there will also be a September Direct to reveal games through to July 2027. While it's possible they put a Zelda focus out in June, especially if they have a bigger game, I think they might want to let Mario have the spotlight for a while longer and then start the Zelda hype window in September, probably replicating the kind of thing they did with September 2025, where they had a big anniversary push and a smaller but still significant title alongside. Fortune's Weave back then, probably a Kirby in a similar spot for this September, and possibly some smaller games that they will be lining up for a Switch Lite model in 2027. However, I could easily see them repeating this long wait strategy early next year, especially given that the Zelda film was delayed from March to May, meaning that if they want to maximize the film hype cycle before announcing something new, we would probably be looking at a July Direct. Nintendo revealed the Switch OLED in July, and they revealed Switch Lite as part of a Direct, so I could definitely see July being the driving force behind the hype in 2027, probably with a major holiday Zelda game being revealed, a focus on Pokemon, and probably an Animal Crossing announcement as the centerpiece of perhaps a July 2027 Nintendo Direct. Alongside that, I think they will use Nintendo Today, as I don't think those major directs will cover the totality of their output and to keep up engagement between the tentpole presentations. Clearly, if the Switch 2 tanks, they may need to change their plans, but I don't know I see this as particularly likely. I tried to hold myself accountable by putting these judgments into forecasts in percentage forms, so let's go ahead with these percentages for now. 90% there's at least one general direct in 2026. 90% there's a presentation in 2026 discussing Zelda's 40th. 90% Nintendo will reveal at least one game this year, less than 12 weeks before its release. 70% there are two general directs in 2026. 70% Animal Crossing is revealed by the end of 2027. 70% Zelda's 40th will be a focus in September. 50% there will be a major presentation in July 2027. 50% there will not be a major general direct in the first quarter of 2027. Of course, a lot could change and Nintendo will adjust their plans to events, so I wouldn't necessarily bet against them changing their approach in the many years to come, but for now, I suspect that they feel this is working for them in the main, as frustrating as it may be to many regular fans. Do check out the videos rocketing on the screen for more. Thanks as ever for watching, thanks to Vice for the question, and to the channel's Patreon backers as well. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.